We're continuing our study of the historical books. These 12 books give us the history of Israel from the time of the conquest of Canaan up until the Jews returned from the Babylonian captivity and rebuilt the wall around Jerusalem. A history of about 800 years. The book of Joshua tells us about the conquest of Canaan. Judges and Ruth tell us about the 350 years the Jews lived under the rule of judges. 2 Samuel tells us about the reign of King Saul. 1 Samuel tells us about the reign of King Saul. 2 Samuel tells us about the reign of King David. And the last event that took place in 2 Samuel was that bad moment in David's life when he ordered a census of Israel's fighting men. That's where we ended last week. The next book or books that we will be studying are 1st and 2nd Kings. 1 Kings opens with the death of King David and his son King Solomon ascending the throne. King Solomon ruled Israel for about 40 years. David ruled for 40 years as well. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam ascended the throne. And he immediately acted foolishly. The leaders of Israel came to Rehoboam and said, you need to lighten up. Solomon had gotten on a building tear. Kings in antiquity tended to do that. They wanted monuments to themselves. Solomon had a lot of good things going for him, but some things were not so good. He taxed the people heavily, and then he forced them to build many of the buildings in Israel. And people were tired of forced labor. They were tired of high taxes, so they came to Rehoboam and said, lighten up. Rehoboam said, I'll think about it. He talked to his father's advisors, and they said, listen to the people. The people have a legitimate complaint. He talked to his drinking buddies, and I don't know that they were his drinking buddies, but they certainly acted like they were drinking buddies because they were loopy. And their advice was, tell the people that you're going to be harsher than your father. And he chose to follow their advice, and he went back and told the people that, and they said, just drop dead. You know, it's one thing to act foolishly politically, but if you're going to do it, king, you better make sure you have the leverage to pull it off. He didn't. So the 10 northern tribes just formed their own nation. So really not very politically savvy. And so from that point on, that was in 931 BC, Israel was two nations. We call this the time of the divided kingdom. And in a very real sense, they remained a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom had 19 kings. It was 10 tribes, 19 kings. It lasted about 200 years before God got so fed up with their wickedness that he brought the Assyrians down to conquer them and rule them. The southern kingdom lasted about 350 years. They lasted a little longer because they had a handful of righteous kings who led the nation into revival. But unfortunately, most of the kings in the south were not good, and eventually God brought the Babylonians against them. The Babylonians conquered them and took essentially the entire population back to Babylon. They destroyed Jerusalem. The Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple and essentially destroyed the country. Now, the story of King Solomon and Israel's time of divided kingdom is a story that is told, or historical record that's told in 1st and 2nd Kings. If we read 1 Samuel, you learn about Saul. 2 Samuel, David. 1 and 2 Kings, you learn about Solomon, and you learn about the time of the divided kingdom up until about 586 BC. If you notice, I have 1 and 2 Chronicles also circled along with 1 and 2 Kings. And what God chose to do was have the prophet Jeremiah write 1 and 2 Kings. And then when Ezra came along, Ezra wrote 1 and 2 Chronicles, which covers much of the same history. In fact, 1 and 2 Chronicles goes back to the last days of King Saul, retells the story of David's reign, and then retells the story of Solomon and the time of the divided kingdom. So the truth of the matter is, if you want to learn about a particular event during the time of Solomon or during the time of the divided kingdom, you have to read the account in both the books of Kings and in the books of Chronicles. Now the question is, why two different accounts of the same period in history? Well, the reason seems to be this. The books of Kings, and originally it was just one book of Kings, and then there was a single book of Chronicles. We'll talk later about why they were divided into two sections. But the books of Kings gave kind of a secular history of the events from the time of Solomon up until the time of the Babylonian captivity. It was more from a human perspective, the nuts and bolts of the history of what was going on. Wars were prominent. It was more a record of both nations, and it focused on man's failure. The books of Chronicles went back into the same history and give us a more spiritual assessment of what was going on. It's almost as though God said to Jeremiah, I want you to write a history of the reign of Solomon and the time of the divided kingdom, the 200 years in which the north was a nation, and then the 350 years in which the south was a separate nation. And write about the kings, the wars, and incidentally, these two nations often fought against each other. So when we think this wasn't two nations as sort of a fiction, they really did not get along. They went their own way. Separate governments, often fighting against each other. But God then says to Ezra, what I want you to do is go back and write that same history that was written in Kings, but from a more spiritual perspective. Whereas in Kings we get the human perspective, in Chronicles a spiritual perspective. In Kings you have wars that are prominent. In Chronicles the temple is prominent. Why? Because that's where God dwelt. In Kings there was a record of both nations. In Chronicles, it focuses on the southern nation, and the reason is because the southern nation was, A, more godly, and B, the southern nation had the temple. The northern nation was much more pagan. And in the books of Kings, they focus on man's failure. In the books of Chronicles, it's a more spiritual perspective on God's faithfulness. He was faithful in spite of their incredible rebellion. And toward the end of the lecture, we're going to get into a brief examination of Hezekiah's wicked son Manasseh and how God was faithful to him in spite of the fact that he was an incredibly wicked man. So these are the books that we're going to be studying over the next few weeks. We're going to be looking at the reign of Solomon, and then we're going to examine the reign of Jeroboam, and who was the first king in the north, and then we'll examine Rehoboam and the kings that followed him in the south. As most of you probably know, Jeroboam introduced golden calf worship to the northern kingdom. Golden calf worship was not, technically speaking, the introduction of another god. We tend to think of golden calf worship as idolatry, and indeed it was, but it was an idolatrous form of Jehovah worship. See, Jeroboam perceived a problem. When he left with the 10 northern nations to form their own nation, the northern kingdom, he was stuck with a bit of a problem. And the problem was this: Jerusalem and the temple that Solomon had built was down south. All he could imagine was his people going south to worship Jehovah and eventually moving their allegiance from himself and the northern kingdom to the south and Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. So he said, I'll tell you what, let's do. Let's have a form of Jehovah worship in the north. We'll put up golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Dan was in the southern end of the northern kingdom, and Dan was in the northern end of the northern kingdom, and Dan was in the Dan and Bethel. Bethel is in the south. Dan is in the north. So he spread it out from one end of his kingdom to the other. And Jehovah worship was the golden calf worship was just another form of Jehovah worship. It was adapting the worship of Jehovah to the culture of the day. And this is one of the lessons you need to learn as we work our way through a study of golden calf worship. You never want to adapt Christianity to the culture. We have a terrible habit of doing that. See, in the culture of the day in which they live, people believed that their gods rode above golden calves. So Jeroboam said, well, let's just put Jehovah above golden calves. And people thought, that's a great idea. all our neighbors are doing with their gods, we can do it with ours. And that prevented people from going south. So anyway, it introduced a heretical form of Jehovah worship, and very quickly things went south and got worse. Rehoboam continued in the south, and in the south there was one dynasty. Remember, a dynasty is the rule of a particular family. And God had promised David in the Davidic covenant, we talked about that several weeks ago, that his throne would be eternal. So God honored that promise, and there was only one dynasty in the south, all descendants of David. In the north, there was one family after another family after another. There were 9 dynasties. All right, with that little bit of an introduction to this area, we'll go on. One other thing that you need to understand, when we go through this period, we look through the events that take place during the reign of Solomon and the time of the divided kingdom. We have to, if any time there's an event that we're going to be examining, we'll look at the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles. You can see that, right? Because both of them record the event. Sometimes one will give you information the other doesn't give you. So if you want to find about a particular event during the time of the divided kingdom, you actually have to read about that event in Kings and in Chronicles. But you also have to read it in the books of prophecy. Because remember, there were 17 books of prophecy: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. You know those books. We talked about this some time ago. Well, all of those prophets, 10 of those prophets, lived during the time of the divided kingdom. So when there's an event that takes place in the time of the divided kingdom, we turn to Chronicles, we turn to Kings, and then we have to find one of the prophets who lived during the time of that particular event and see what he had to say about it. Now, what we're going to do is, when we work our way through this, I'm not going to go through Kings and then come back and talk about Chronicles. What we're going to do is just talk about Solomon, then we're going to work our way through these events that took place during the time of the divided kingdom. And when we come to an event, I'll try to give you the record of that event as it's found in Kings and Chronicles and in the prophets. Okay? That makes it a little easier. The northern kingdom, as I already pointed out, lasted about 200 years. It was so wicked, God finally brought the Assyrians against it. It ceased to be a nation. The southern kingdom did a little better. They had a few godly kings. It lasted a little bit longer. But finally, it got so bad, God brought the Babylonians against it. The Babylonians came down and conquered the southern kingdom the first time in 605. And that's when they took Daniel away into captivity. During this period of time, there was a great prophet named Jeremiah, and he warned the people before 605, before the Babylonians conquered them the first time. He warned them to stop being so idolatrous. He kept warning them, if you continue to be idolatrous, God is going to punish you with the Babylonians. And the people, of course, listened to him, right? They didn't. And so the Babylonians came and conquered them. It didn't destroy Jerusalem, didn't destroy the temple. It didn't take a whole lot of folks away into captivity. They took some. And that's when Daniel went away into captivity. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, remember those guys? So they went away into captivity. Now, Jeremiah gets on the scene again. He said, I warned you before the Babylonians came that if you didn't get your act together, God was going to bring the Babylonians, and a bunch of false prophets saying, don't listen to him. He's just one of those crazy fundamentalists that keep talking about doom. Well, doom came. So now he says, folks, don't you remember I told you this was going to happen? Now what you need to do is you need to submit to the authority of the Babylonians, because they, the Babylonians, are God's instrument for punishing you for your sinful behavior. So submit. There's a time to submit. The time to clean up your act and fight was prior to the first coming of the Babylonians. Now it's time to submit. Did they listen to him? No, they didn't listen. So they continued to rebel. So in 597, the Babylonians came and reconquered them. And Jeremiah said, folks, I keep warning you to clean up your act. I've told you that before the Babylonians came, that if you didn't stop sinning, that God was going to bring them against you. And after they came and conquered you, I said, submit to them, because they're God's instrument for punishing you. Now they've come again. Obey them. They are God's instrument for punishing you. To rebel against the Babylonians is to rebel against God. They didn't listen then either. Well, they were stiff-necked and stubborn. Moses talked about that while they were still wandering in the wilderness. So finally, in 586 BC, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar came again. This time he was fed up. He destroyed the country. He destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, knocked down the wall, and carried away essentially the entire population. Took them all back to Babylon as slaves, as captives. He left a few stragglers behind. You had the invalids, the malcontents, the alcoholics, the people that nobody wants. They were left behind. And he knew about Jeremiah as a prophet, and he told Jeremiah that if Jeremiah wanted to come with him to Babylon, he would give him a prominent position as he had to Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Jeremiah said, no, I'm going to stay with these people. And the people then, his message to the people at this point was, stay in the land, and even though the Babylonians are our conquerors and our masters, if you'll obey them now, God will give you a measure of peace and prosperity here in the land. Again, they didn't listen. There wasn't enough of them left to rebel, so they left for Egypt. And they took Jeremiah with them, and the tradition is that they put him in a log. They got so fed up with it, they put him in a log and sawed him in two. I don't know. We sort of lose track of Jeremiah there, but this is a very sad moment in Israel's history. Now, that's just a brief overview of the time of the divided kingdom. There are a number of subjects that we're going to be talking about as we work our way through this period in Israel's history. Keep in mind that it lasted about 350 years, 200 years or thereabouts in the history of the northern kingdom, 350-year history for the southern kingdom. We're going to talk about the reign of King Solomon, a remarkable reign, and Solomon's reign was indeed the golden era in Israel's history. It was the golden era. It was never richer. The nation was never richer or more powerful than it was during the time of King Solomon. But that was primarily because of the work David, his father, had already done. David had built a great army. He had conquered and subdued all of the Canaanite city-states within the borders of Israel, and he conquered and subdued the surrounding Gentile nations. So when Solomon came in, he had a ready-made thing going for him. And he was a smart man, great architect, great scientist, and he was able to capitalize on what his father had done. The second major event we'll talk about was the foolishness of his son Rehoboam, who lost the kingdom. The third event, and we've already talked about it briefly, was that of Jeroboam introducing the golden calf worship of Jehovah. And we're going to look at this briefly because you need to appreciate how odious it is to play games with Christianity or Judaism. God has made it very clear to us in his word how we're supposed to approach him. He doesn't leave it up to us. He just doesn't leave it up to us. We've talked about this before. The first commandment is no other gods, yes? The second commandment is not a repeat. The second commandment is, now don't play games with me. Now, I know it doesn't described that way in the book of Exodus. First commandment, no other God. Second commandment, no images. And the image, what he's saying is, now that you've decided, first commandment, no other gods, and you decided to worship me, I don't want you to make an idol of me. In short, God doesn't want us to define who he is. This is why studying the Bible is so important. Because a lot of people I've talked to Christians and about God, and I listen to them talking. I don't know who they're talking about. What they've done is they've just sort of played games with him. And invariably we make him into what we want him to be. God is too loving to send anyone to hell. Where did you get that information? Well, they just sort of make it up. And then there's this phrase that sort of leads into a long paragraph. And the phrase begins with, well, I know God wants me to do this. And I'm going to say, or let me rephrase that. I know this is what Jesus would do. Now, when they start out with that, I cringe because invariably they get it wrong. Because what they think Jesus would do is what they just sort of made up in their own minds. So it's not enough that we worship the true and living God. We have to worship him as he's presented himself and approach him the way he asks us to approach him. He defines who he is. We don't. He defines how we approach him. We don't. Unfortunately, the story of the golden calves is a story of a group of people rejecting that idea, and sadly we've picked it up in Christendom. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Jeremiah and the golden calves. After about 60 years after the kingdom was divided, things got worse. They went from golden calf worship to Baal worship. And this took place under the rulership of Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Jezebel was not an Israelite. Jezebel was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were cities in what is today modern Lebanon. Ahab married the wicked Jezebel. Now, he's one of the northern kings. That's the reason I have everybody up here is in the north, people down here in the south. That's how I'm trying to lay out on this schematic. And Jezebel was in love with Baal. And she wanted Baal to be the official god in Israel. This idea of worshiping Jehovah above those golden calves is not something she wanted anything. She didn't want to anything. She didn't want to have anything to do with that. Furthermore, she didn't want the northern kingdom to have anything to do with Jehovah. She wanted all the prophets of Baal, of Jehovah, even as heretical as they were at the temples with the golden calves, she wanted them wiped out, and she wanted Baal to be the official prophet, the official god of the northern kingdom. Those were very dark days. Anyone who worshiped Jehovah was threatened with death. And it was into this situation that God raised up a prophet named Elijah, who had a great showdown with the 450 prophets of Baal. Most of you are familiar with the story. We'll spend a little time. It's one of the great stories in the Bible. So you see something else taking place here. You see days getting darker, but then God responds. God responds by raising up a prophet who will challenge those who would darken his country. So we'll be talking a little bit about Elijah, and then after Elijah ascended to heaven, his student, Elisha, took over, and they were both quite remarkable men. So we're going to spend a little bit of time with those. Those are both prophets in the north. And then we'll spend a little time talking about the Assyrian captivity after 200 years. The Assyrians came, conquered the 10 northern tribes, or the northern kingdom. They took only about 50,000 back into captivity. Now, when the Babylonians conquered the south, they essentially eviscerated the southern kingdom. They destroyed everything and took most of the people back to Babylon. When the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, they only took about 50,000 back to Assyria, which is northern Iraq. And then what they did was they imported their own people from Mesopotamia. And those people ruled the northern kingdom as a separate kingdom. They intermarried with the Jews in the north, and so the men and women in the north became sort of hybrids, part Jew, part Gentile. And at the time of Christ, which is 700 years later, we know them as the Samaritans. And they had a form of Judaism, but it was their own man-made form of Judaism. And they were half-breeds, and they hated the Jews, and the Jews hated them, as you can imagine. We'll spend a little time on that. Now, this was just a map showing, this is Nineveh. Nineveh is the capital city of the Assyrians. They came down and conquered Samaria. This, incidentally, the ruins of Nineveh are still there, and it's on the eastern side of the Tigris River, and on the western side is Mosul, which is in the news today. It's being fought over. All right, after the Assyrian captivity, just a few years after the Assyrian captivity, things weren't great down south, but every so often somebody good came along. And just 7 years after the Assyrian captivity in the north, God raised up a wonderful king in the south named Hezekiah. He is, of the 19 kings in the north, the 19 kings in the north, all were evil. In the south, they also had 19 kings. 2 were excellent, and 6 were good, and 11 were evil. Hezekiah was one of the good ones. He was a remarkable man. Let's read about him. Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother was Abijah, daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. And incidentally, David is the standard in which they measure kings. As you read through the books of Kings and Chronicles, God will often talk about a particular king and will measure him against David. How do you compare to David? Well, Hezekiah compared favorably to David. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places. Now, let me explain about this expression, high places. You read it over and over and over again as you work your way through Kings and Chronicles and the books of prophecy. High places speak of places where people build altars to their gods. Now, the god may be Baal. The god may be the starry host. The god may be Jehovah. They believed that if the higher up they got, the closer they got to their gods. So they built high places. When we talk about high places, it may be talking about a high place where they worshiped an idolatrous or false god, or it may be a place where they worshiped Jehovah. They did both. God didn't want them to do any of those things. Obviously, he didn't want them to do idolatry, but he didn't want them to worship himself, Jehovah, on high places, because he knew they'd start playing games with it, which they, of course, did. He said, do it my way. And they were supposed to worship him in Jerusalem, but unfortunately, they would go to high places. So he removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles. Asherah pole, let me explain what an Asherah pole is. Baal was big, as you know. It was a big false god in Israel. Generally, Baal had an altar with a statue, and then next to him would be a pole. That was the Asherah pole. They believed that represented his female consort, Asherah. So there was Baal, and then there was his wife, Asherah. Baal, there would be an altar, and then there would be this Asherah pole. They're talking about his wife, or female consort, or they played, each city had its own approach to worshiping Baal. Well, we play games with Christianity, haven't we? We have Catholicism, we have Protestantism, and Protestants, we have conservatives and liberals, we have Seventh-day Adventists, we have Jehovah's Witnesses, which is a modification of Christianity, we have Mormonism, which is a modification of Christianity. We all play games with our religion. Rather than just saying, let's do it by the book, we play games with it. Well, they did too. In fact, it's very interesting if you read about Baal in the land of Canaan in antiquity. There'd be one town over here that would make Asherah his female consort. This would make him his wife. This one a mother. They would change his entire biography, and they'd see they're 5 miles apart. You'd think, does anyone think this through? It doesn't seem to bother them. So as you read through these books in the Old Testament, sometimes you get information that seems conflicting, but keep in mind that people didn't have there was no standardized place where they could go. This is who Baal is, this is who Asher is, pay attention. But we don't do it with Christianity, so it's not surprising that they didn't. In any event, he did, and we're talking about Hezekiah, what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father had done. He removed the high places. Keep in mind that could be a high place to worship Jehovah or Baal. He smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles, Baal's female consort. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. You're saying, what was that? Well, hundreds of years earlier, when the children of Israel were wandering through the wilderness, remember, they got really, really rebellious and really, really nasty, and God sent a bunch of poisonous vipers to bite them as punishment for their sinful behavior. And then they decided, when they were being bitten by the snakes, that they should repent. And so they said, I guess we've sinned. So plead our case before Jehovah. So Moses did. And if you remember, God told Moses to make a serpent out of bronze, put it on a pole, and all they had to do was look and live. We've talked about that. We don't need to go through that story again. Well, people love religious relics. They were still worshiping it. They're worshiping it 700 years later. Keep in mind, how could they do that? We do it in Christendom. We have, how many splinters are there of the cross? Someone said there are hundreds. If you put all the splinters of crosses there are in the world today, you'd have hundreds of crosses. And people travel to them, they bow down before them. this whole religious relic thing is sad. And unfortunately, the bronze serpent was still there. We'll talk a little bit about it when we get to that moment in their history. But he said, this is it. This is nonsense. He broke it up. By that time, the Israelites were burning incense to it. And that was bad. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not cease to follow him. He kept the commands of the Lord had given to Moses. The Lord was with him. He was successful in whatever he did. One of the really, truly great kings. So, not only are we going to spend a few minutes talking about King Hezekiah, the other great king in the south was King Josiah. King Hezekiah ruled, let me back it up a moment, and he ruled from 715 to 686 BC. He came to the throne just shortly after the Assyrian captivity. And he ruled for 50 years. Then he died. And for the next 50 years, the southern kingdom fell into extremely sinful behavior. And God raised up a second king called Josiah. Josiah ruled for about 30 years. And he, like Hezekiah, was a remarkably fine king. Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 31 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David, not turning aside to the right or to the left. Josiah was, in his 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, carved idols, and cast images. Under his direction, the altars of Baal were torn down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles, the idols, and the images. And he did something else. He restored the temple. It had fallen into disrepair. Keep in mind, Hezekiah had been dead now for about 50 years. So Josiah came to the throne. He, like Hezekiah, is a godly man. He tears down the idols. He purges the land. And then he says, the temple has fallen in disrepair. So he sent them in to clean up and repair the temple. And guess what they discovered? The Bible. Not they say the Bible, the book of Moses. The book of Moses is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Because that's about all they had at that point in time. So what they discovered was the book. And so he had them read it to him. And let's read about that. When the king heard the words of the law, he tore his robes. He gave these orders to Hilkiah. Go and inquire of the Lord for me and for the remnant in Israel and Judah about what is written in this book that has been found. Great is the Lord's anger that is poured out on us because our fathers have not kept the word of the Lord. Really? They have not acted in accordance with all that is written in this book. He was grieved. He had the book of Moses read to him, the same book that we've been going through. And he was grieved because they had not kept the law of the Lord. So, the reign of King Solomon is what we'll start with, in the foolish reign of Rehoboam. Then Jeroboam. We'll talk about the dark days of Ahab and Jezebel, how God then raised up Elijah and Elisha. We'll talk about the Assyrian captivity, and then the revivals under Hezekiah and King Josiah. And finally, we'll talk about the Babylonian captivity, which ends our time in the books of Kings and Chronicles and the time of the divided kingdom. What happened, the reason there was a Babylonian captivity rather in the south as opposed to an Assyrian captivity is because in 612, the Babylonians conquered Nineveh, the capital city of the Assyrian Empire, and they became the Gentile powers. Prior to this time, Nineveh was the Gentile power at the time that God punished the northern kingdom, so he sent the Assyrians down to conquer the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom, incidentally, wanted to conquer the southern kingdom. We'll be talking about that a little bit, but we're not successful. What happened then was in 612, the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians. All they had to do was conquer the capital city, and then they took over all of the Assyrian Empire. So they became the big power who in 586 conquered the southern kingdom and deported the entire population back to Babylon and Mesopotamia. These are, again, the major events that we're going to be studying over the next few weeks. Now, on page 650, I've given you a list. You can read that, can't you? Sort of. That's amazing. I wasn't quite sure. But what I've done was I've given you a list of all the kings in the north and in the south. And now we're not going to go through the 19 kings in the south, and we're not going to go through all these 19 kings in the north. The reason I gave you this list is so that if you get ambitious and decide you want to read through the books of Kings and Chronicles, this will be a little compass to show you where you are. Because they'll be mentioning this king did this, that prophet did the other thing, and you'll say, what's going on? Where does this fit in the big scheme of things? Well, I have this 350-year period of time. With this little chart of the list of the kings, you'll be able to keep track of what you're doing and where you're going. This is also helpful when you're reading through the books of prophecy, because these prophets ruled during the reigns of various kings. So if you come to this chart on page 650, it'll help you keep track of things. Now, on this chart, you'll also know that in red, I have 9 kings in red. They represent the new dynasties. And you all understand a dynasty, right? One family rules, and then a son rules, and a grandson rules. Then somebody else comes in, kills everybody, and starts a new dynasty. There were 9 dynasties in the north. Why was there only one dynasty in the south? Because God had promised David that his throne was eternal. So this is another internal proof of the truthfulness of Scriptures. God made a promise to David that your throne is eternal. Your throne will be established. And he still has a descendant sitting on his throne one day, Jesus Christ. Now, also on this chart, the list of the 19 kings in the southern kingdom, I have an asterisk by 6 of the names of 6 kings, 2 asterisks by the names of 2 other kings. And the 6 are the 2 asterisks, I can't pronounce that. I shouldn't have to. Of the 2 excellent kings, the 6 are the 6 good kings, and all the rest of them are evil. Now, how do we measure the excellent from the good from the bad? The 2 kings that were excellent were Hezekiah and Josiah. They were excellent because they were genuine worshipers of Jehovah. They were excellent because they destroyed Israel's idols and led a national revival. They were excellent because they not only worshiped the true and living God, but because they used their power as kings to force that on everybody else. Let's throw out all the idols. And they led great revivals. The 6 kings we view as good are good because they were genuine worshipers of Jehovah, but they failed to be excellent because they didn't lead the nation out of idolatry. You see the difference? That's the difference. You got 8 that are okay. You got 11 that were horrible. They're really evil. You have 8 that are decent. 2 of those are excellent. The reason 2 were excellent and the others were okay was because the excellent ones not only worshiped Jehovah, but they led a national revival. These 6 worshiped him, but they didn't lead a national revival, so they don't get the excellent rating. And then finally, there were 11 kings in the southern kingdom that were evil. Let me give you an example of 2, Ahab and Manasseh. They were evil because they were idolaters, and they encouraged idolatry. We'll read about Manasseh, and we'll close up with our examination and brief examination of Manasseh. And Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 55 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. He also erected altars to the Baals and made Asherah poles. He bowed down to all the starry hosts and worshiped them. This is bad. He built altars in the temple of the Lord. He even went into the temple of Jehovah and built altars to foreign gods. Bad. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "My name will remain in Jerusalem forever." In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to all the starry hosts. And this is the really bad line. He sacrificed his sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. In the valley of Ben Hinnom is where they built the idol to Moloch. That's the idol to which they offered up their sons as sacrifices. So he sacrificed his sons in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom, practiced sorcery, divination, and witchcraft, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Manasseh led Judah and the people of Israel astray, so that they did more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. Now this is an artist's depiction of the god Moloch. If you go through a dictionary, you'll see various depictions because, as I've tried to point it out, each group makes its own modification. Now this depiction of Moloch is a depiction of this idol which has a human body and the head of a calf. It was made of metal and it was hollow. And what they would do is they would build a fire down below at the base of this idol so that the heat would rise up. And then this idol from one end to the other would become red hot. And after it became red hot, they would take their babies, lay the babies into the hands, the red hot hands of Moloch, and watch their baby burn to death. That was the vile and disgusting worship of Moloch. It's been suggested that if the voices from the screams, this is speaking poetically, if the voices from the screams of these babies were stored in a warehouse somewhere in the universe, it would be a big warehouse. But it wouldn't begin to compare to the warehouse storing the screams of the babies we're dismembering in abortions. So we look at this and we say, that's horrible. How could they do that? We're doing worse. I don't think they kill 55 million. But can you imagine red hot, laying the baby there and watching it burn to death as it screamed. And the mothers were lined up. And we wonder, why did God hate the religion of the Canaanites? Why did God want them destroyed? He said, when you go in there, destroy them all. Why? Because they're going to snare you. They're going to suck you up into this horrible religion, and I don't want that. Was that unloving? I would argue that's loving. People say, it was unloving of God to send them in to kill the Canaanites. No, I would argue this is what he wanted to avoid. What could be more loving than having them avoid that? Anyway, that's my hobby horse. The god Moloch, the false god Moloch, and its altars were placed in the Hinnom Valley. We read a bit earlier that he offered up his sons in the Hinnom Valley. Hinnom Valley is part of Jerusalem. Here's the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, Mount Moriah, where Solomon built the first temple, Mount Zion, where the kings had their palaces, and a few hundred yards southwest is the Valley of Hinnom, where they built their altar to Moloch and where they undoubtedly offered up thousands of babies to this wicked and vile god. When the children of Israel returned from the Babylonian captivity, now remember this happened just before they went away into the Babylonian captivity. They went away into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. When they returned from the Babylonian captivity, they came back with one great improvement. Israel never became idolatrous again. They developed other problems. But, you know, if we've been together now for several months, and we've been talking about Israel was idolaters from the moment they left Egypt. Remember, they brought their gods out with them. And they were constantly idolatrous. They would worship Jehovah, but they would worship Baal and Asherah and Moloch and the starry host and all these other things. It was a constant problem. The Babylonian captivity cured them of idolatry. They developed other problems, but one thing they got cured of was idolatry. No more false gods. No more idols. Which led to a very interesting phenomenon. When they came back, they rebuilt the wall around Jerusalem, rebuilt the temple. They looked at the Hinnom Valley, and they were appalled at this. That's good. And they said nothing could, we can't have anything to do with the horrible valley. So what they did was they made it a garbage dump. And then they burned their garbage. And in fact, people kept throwing garbage on it, and the fire never went out. And what's interesting about it, Jesus picked up on that and said, if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye than with two eyes, to be thrown into Gehenna. The name Hinnon in Greek is Gehenna. So better to have your eye torn out than being thrown into Hinnon or Gehenna, which is synonyms for hell or the lake of fire. So what happened was the Hinnon Valley became a symbol in Judaism of the eternal lake of fire, where the fire never goes out. Why does the fire never go out there? Because it was a garbage dump. They just kept throwing the garbage on, so the fire went day and night. Now, that's the derivation of the lake of fire. Jesus picked up on it and said, this is where you don't want to be. Our story of Manasseh does not end with the events we've just talked about. God was furious with him, understandably so. And the Assyrians came and captured him and imprisoned him in Babylon. And while he was in prison, he repented. And let's read about his repentance. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. So the Lord brought against them the army commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh prisoner, put a hook in his nose, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. In his distress he sought the favor of the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. So he brought him back to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew the Lord as God. He got rid of the foreign gods and removed the image from the temple of the Lord, as well as all the altars he had built on the temple hill and in Jerusalem, and he threw them out of the city. He restored the altar of the Lord and sacrificed fellowship offerings and thank offerings on it, and told Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. The people, however, continued to sacrifice at high places, but only to the Lord their God. So, Manasseh has a very vile history. But God's grace is bigger than his vile history. Isn't that marvelous? I mean, I look at that and I'd say, fry that guy. Come on, man. I'm weak and I'm shallow. I just look at that man. He built this god Moloch. He offered his sons, live sons, laying them in the hands and watching them burn to death. How disgusting. And encouraged others to do it. When he repented, God restored him. God's grace is bigger than Manasseh's vile sinfulness. That's really kind of staggering, but that's comforting, isn't it? That's comforting. That's the kind of God we serve. So when he talks about his graciousness and his mercy, folks, these are not just words. This is real stuff. Look at what he did with Manasseh. Totally amazing. This then is the history we're going through over the next few weeks. Lord willing, we'll get something out of it. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We worship you. We thank you. I thank you for your graciousness. To Manasseh, I thank you for your graciousness to me, your graciousness to my brothers and sisters in this room. I pray, Lord, as we work our way through these books of Kings and Chronicles, you would help us get a greater insight into who you are and who we are, how wonderful you are. Bless our time together, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.